By now, you've probably heard about the Next.js security incident. Middleware can effectively be skipped entirely. This is really, really bad, putting hundreds of thousands of Next apps at risk, right? There is a lot of subtlety here that we have to dig into. There's a lot of things Vercel did absolutely wrong, and I am excited to roast them indefinitely for it. But there are other things here that are just fundamentally being misunderstood. And for what it's worth, I've never seen an app that would have been vulnerable to this, despite the fact that I've audited literally hundreds of Next.js apps. That doesn't mean this is okay, but it does make the characteristics of the exploit so much more interesting. So if you want a video that's just going to bash Vercel endlessly for bothering to ship Next.js that's focused on people who don't use it at all, go watch something else. But if you want an actual deep dive figuring out what went wrong, why we're here, what problems led to the outrage and the incident in the first place, and how to prevent these things going forward, this is the video to watch. I'm very excited to break all of this down with you, but as Vercel is no longer a sponsor of the channel, someone has to cover the bill. So we're going to hear a quick word from today's sponsor and then go right back in. Today's sponsor is one of those products that I really wish I had used for more of my stuff because it would have made my life significantly easier and it solves a ton of problems I have every day. That product is Convex, and I could tell you all about how it solves the missing half of your React app, but I'd rather just show you. This is a real code base using Convex with Next.js, and it's super easy to set up. You might even notice the little Theo Brown in the corner here. That's because it already has auth set up too, because it's just one of the many things Convex provides for you. Nothing too impressive, right? Well, let's look at what happens if I open up another window with the same project. I'll send another message and watch. It automatically appears in both, even though these are entirely different browsers. They could be different networks, different devices, different anything. As long as they're querying the same data, it gets automatically updated. The code for this must be super complex, right? Well, here's the message list. I use query API messages list. And here I list the messages. Where's the update? Well, if we go to API messages list, which you can command click, we go into this Convex folder in our code base, which has messages TS. And here I have my list function. It has empty args, because we don't pass it anything. And the handler is an async function with context. And I use that to get messages from the DB, order by descending, and I take the first 100. And now it just automatically live updates. That's all you have to do. There is no additional work to trigger the update. Simply by this query's data changing, Convex is smart enough to post and push out an update to all clients that are affected by that change. And the result honestly kind of feels like magic, not having to do all the work to keep different devices in sync with different states. If I had used this for T3 chat, all of our sync engine problems would be gone. And if this was something that didn't scale, that'd be one thing. But the guys who built Convex are industry experts in scalable data solutions. This stuff will run as far as you'll ever possibly need it to go. They built Dropbox. They know what they're doing. So if you're building a React app that needs stuff like, server functions, database, vector search, cron jobs, auth, file management, type safety across the wire, real-time updates, any of these things, I am very confident that Convex is the best place to get started. If it was just me saying it, that's one thing, but Tanner Lindsley has been telling me to take these guys more seriously, and there's no one whose word I hold higher than my own than Tanner Lindsley. So don't take my word for it, take his, and all the other people who are becoming obsessed with Convex. These guys know what they're doing. Check them out today at soidev.link/convex. So I have put together a demo app here to showcase the exploit. There's a couple pieces I want to emphasize. We have two different routes that matter. We have this admin route that has a layout and a page. We have the unauth route, which just has a page that says you're not supposed to be wherever you're going. And I have this sensitive.txt, this text data that I want to make sure only gets to a user if they're allowed. The middleware is a function that runs between when Next starts to process your request and the user who's making that request. So if we diagram this out really quick, the hierarchy of things should hopefully be pretty clear. We have our user. The user wants to make a request to go to some page. The first thing that happens when the user makes the request is if you have a middleware file, it gets hit. So the middleware is this layer that exists between the user and whatever they are trying to do on your service. The middleware will take this request, we'll say it's to /admin, and it will make a decision based on characteristics of this request as to where to send this. You might have these two different pages. We have /unauthed and we have /admin, and the middleware decides where this request actually ends up going. Does it go to /unauthed or does it go to /admin? In the code I've written here, the thing that decides it is pretty simple. I have this cookie that's super secure named isAdmin, If you don't have the isadmin cookie set and the request is to /admin, then I redirect you to /unauth. So if I go to my service here and we go to /admin, we get this "you aren't supposed to go wherever you just went" text. But if I change my local cookies by going into storage, cookies, so if I go add the isadmin cookie, I'll set the value to true. Cool. We now have this new cookie isadmin. And if I go to /admin again, it lets us through. So what's the exploit? The exploit is a way to bypass that middleware layer with a specific header. So if I currently was to go curl that page, let me just open up my terminal and do that. Curl HTTP localhost 3000 /admin, it redirects to /unauth. And if I give it the header, you know what? I'm not smart enough to do this. t3.chat, write a curl request that hits localhost 3000 /admin with a cookie named isadmin set to true. Thank you, T3chat. We paste that, and now we're getting an actual response that is the content of that page that we're not supposed to have access to. This makes sense because I put in the cookie. If this was a real cookie for a real service, that'd be fine. Obviously, we shouldn't just check if it exists. We should check if it's valid or not. Fine. The problem is if we put in that specific header, remove the cookie, and instead add the following header. Give it the value true as well. So here I am telling my server with a header that this is a middleware sub request. If I copy this, paste it, it still is trying to redirect to unauthed. Very interesting. That does it. Okay, that's silly. So in order to bypass that cookie check, we have to do this really fascinating call here where middleware sub request is middleware : middleware : middleware : middleware : middleware. Interesting. That works though. Wild. And this is obviously really bad. If you're doing auth in your middleware and someone hits your service with that very strange header, they can now bypass all of the things you might have been protecting through middleware, which, if you don't know Next well, sounds like the most terrifying thing in the world. But here's where I'm going to start roasting Vercel in a way you guys might not expect. Things Vercel did wrong. Big thing number one, middleware is terribly named. Vercel has this bad habit of giving things names to try to showcase the conceptual place it fits, but not the actual use case or behaviors it's good for. Middleware is a term for a thing between the main logic and the requester for that logic. But usually when people talk about middleware, they imply something specific, which is the thing that does all the common work between different requests. If you're used to using tools like Express or backend frameworks in other languages, middleware is the stuff that you use always. Every request goes through middleware, and all of your auth logic and things like that tend to live in that middleware layer. The disclosure article even makes the same assumption here. First off, they call Next a complete framework, which if you know anything about Next, you know it is not. Next has no concept of auth in it. It isn't a complete framework. This is bad framing and has me concerned about how much the researcher actually knows about what Next is and does. It's not comparable to something like Laravel or Rails. It doesn't have any of these parts. And then they imply with the middleware that it's an important and widely used feature, specifically for authentication and authorization. If you've used Next for a while, a lot of red flags should be going off in your head because you should not be using it that way. Middleware in Next.js is not a good place to do auth. Next.js middleware is a glorified switch statement for routing. When I was talking about this on Twitter, somebody replied, wait, so it's basically just an early return? Yes, that is the right way to think about middleware in Next. The reason that this middleware layer exists is because you shouldn't have to boot up your whole Next app to do certain things. If you have a page that a user is trying to get to that requires them to be signed in, it'd be very convenient if you could just redirect them to the sign-in page instead. That is what this is for. It is meant to be a route level helper. Generally speaking, if you're hitting database in middleware, you're using it wrong. If you are protecting data with middleware, you're using it wrong. And I understand why people would. Not only have they named it terribly, like this should not be named middleware. That is not what it is. I would name it like route interceptor or something, because that's what it actually does. Next.js's middleware concept is not what we know of as middleware. And this has caused them problems in the past because, one more fun fact, Next.js middleware doesn't run in Node. Yes, crazy enough, the Next.js middleware wasn't built for Node because it's built to run before the Node service spins up. The goal of this is to let you not have to spin up your whole Next.js app. Instead, you have this tiny file that is fully isolated from the rest of your code base that can do the little bit of work necessary to make sure the user goes to the right place. The best case for something like this is handling stuff like localization. If I have a user in a specific region that isn't English speaking that is trying to go to /shop/item/item ID, I might want them to actually go to /en/shop/item/item ID. Middleware is phenomenal at this. This is what it is good for. It can take this URL and based on characteristics of the request, quietly rewrite it or redirect it under the hood. I can redirect here, but I can also rewrite here. And now the URL that the user sees won't be different, but the experience the user has will be. They have added experimental support for running the Next middleware in Node if you're deploying on something like Docker and you want support for the middleware layer. But generally speaking, in those environments, you probably don't want to be using the middleware at all because its strength is as a glorified switch statement, not as an actual primitive that you're relying on to do anything in your app. The middleware for all of the stuff we have shipped at Ping is hilariously small. If we hop to the T3 chat repo, we don't even have a middleware in here. Yeah, we literally don't. But if I go to PickThing, for example, where we do, because we use Clerk there, here's the middleware we have for Clerk. The Clerk middleware here isn't blocking access to anything. All this is doing by default is adding the right data to the headers for this request so that we know once it gets to our server who you are. It validates the cookies so that we have them by the time it makes it to our stuff. And even that isn't a great use case for middleware. I much prefer doing this through stuff like tRPC. And if we find in this code base, I'm sure I have the API tRPC route. We can use this to follow back to the tRPC context. Here is where I'm actually checking auth. This is real code running on our servers for our Next app that verifies auth by calling the auth function. As soon as you call the auth function anywhere in your code base that isn't the middleware TS file, this problem is solved. And if you're doing something like in this example, where we are reading the sensitive file, we should be checking first that the person is who they say they are. So if we don't have this isAdmin call pass, we should redirect them to the right place. So here we're now doing this right. We're checking cookies. We're checking if the isAdmin cookie is set. And if not, we are redirecting the way that you would have done in middleware. If you're accessing sensitive data in your code, the path to that code, ideally in the same place as that code, should clearly call out who can access it and the permissions for that thing. Permissions are not a route level problem. Permissions are an access level problem. And if you're writing code that allows for access to data blindly, your routing table is not how you define what a user should or shouldn't be able to do. And as far as I have seen, there are no real apps that do their authentication exclusively in the middleware. I've never seen that in my life. The only reason you would do that is if you're coming from other frameworks and also, frankly, you read the docs without reading the details. This is where I started to get spicy. I was part of this long thread where people were talking about why shouldn't we do auth in the middleware? Because other people, like Shaddix here, said auth middleware shouldn't be doing much other than redirecting you to the sign-in page if you don't have a session, right? It'd be pretty scary to use that Next middleware as your only access control. Aaron, the creator of Replication Zero, asked why not. I said that Next middleware is not part of the Node runtime. It runs before the Next app is hit, meant to allow for quick routing changes and not much else. He then cited this page from the Next docs that lists authentication and authorization in the use cases for middleware. This is really bad. That is embarrassingly bad. So much so that I called it out here. I said, what the fuck are you saying in the docs, guys? Tagged in Lee, and within a couple minutes, he had published a PR removing that section entirely because we should not be encouraging the use of middleware in Next for auth. That's not what it's for. It's an optimistic routing layer to send the user to the right place. That's all it's meant to be for. So the first big thing Vercel did wrong, middleware is atrociously named. It is not what that is for, and I understand why people are confused because they're coming from other places where middleware means a specific thing, and it doesn't mean that thing here. I see one fair call out, which is the only issue with using auth code in your actual code like we did here with the admin check is that you can't cache it because it's not going to allow for static generation if we're doing dynamic stuff. Yeah, data that needs to be behind an auth wall of some form should absolutely be dynamic. You should not expose data that needs an auth wall in a static fashion because you cannot trust the cache. This is Colin's take on it. If you're not familiar, he's the CEO of Clerk. We don't fully agree, but I want to try and bridge the gap a little bit here. Colin tells us that the sites that are most likely to be impacted by this are ones that are guarding static content via middleware. The reason you'd want to do this is you have something like a secret blog that is being generated at build time. You don't want that to be exposed. You would use your middleware layer to prevent it. I don't like the idea of a build step generating assets that are meant to be guarded via auth. There are too many different ways a CDN will deploy those assets for me to ever trust that. So personally, I would never have a build step that generates an HTML page that is now a static asset that is meant to be cached if I expect that data to be private. The idea of static, cache, and private are contradictory in my head. And I don't like the idea of trusting really anything to take static content and lock it down like that. If you're already checking auth anyways, just generate the content dynamically or add a really light cache wrapper with unstable cache or the new Next dynamic stuff. Use cache is actually a pretty cool primitive. I don't like the idea of static generation generating private data. That said, there is one part I do agree with here, which is that you should expect the middleware to always run. That's the point of it. The fact that this promise and expectation broke down is a fundamental failure on the Next team. I understand. That is fair. But I also don't think it should be used this way. And the reason this happened is a gap in the understanding of the Next team and how this thing should be used, the Next DevRels and education side and how it should be used, in the public and what the word middleware means. Those three things not being aligned is what resulted in the outrage here and also resulted in the problem. Because the use cases for middleware, the expectations of middleware, and the implementation of middleware were not properly aligned. Also from Colin, it's relatively rare to build a site that offers gated static content. And we have additional protections for dynamic apps that access authentication data after middleware. This is a thing Colin and I have argued on a bunch. As I mentioned before, by default, Clerk would block any API access that wasn't authed through Clerk. So if I have an endpoint like /API/Stripe that's being hit by Stripe's webhooks, it breaks if you set up Clerk the way they did by default. The majority of our tickets for upload thing for over a year were Clerk because their defaults were shit. And it took me over a year of pestering Colin and the Clerk team for them to finally admit that I was right. I had to fight for so long, and it seems like they're still pushing the other way. I still love Clerk. They're still my default auth solution for almost everything I build, but this is a fundamental disagreement I have with them about the role of middleware in Next. It's also worth noting that they initially came out saying that they were unaffected, and then it turns out they were, with a different additional header you had to add. Thankfully, they addressed it really quickly and handled it on their server side, if I recall. They said that the developers using Clerk are not impacted, then followed up with, this tweet is not accurate for all developers using Clerk, more info. You call any of the following methods in routes protected by middleware, your page or endpoint is safe. Yes, if you call any auth function anywhere in your logic, you're fine. The next point makes me want to rename this things that hurt Vercel here. I'm going to rename this because not all of these are necessarily their fault. The next point's an interesting one. Vercel is having a full company off-site right now. This is hilarious to me. The timing is so unfortunate. But at this moment, pretty much every Vercel employee is at a whole company on-site event where they're all hanging out together in person. Vercel is a super remote company. So this is bad timing because having everybody in one place, half of them on airplanes in the moment, means your ability to respond to these types of things is not where it normally would be. That combined with the fact that a lot of people have gripes against Vercel, this allowed for a lot of people who are angry at Vercel to go off because security issues, rightfully, are a thing that we as a community are very sensitive to. So if you're a person that has an incentive to make Vercel look bad, you're going to take the opportunity. And credit where it's due, people like Dax were really reasonable middle ground here, where obviously they love dunking on Vercel, but they actually know Next well enough to know the characteristics of why this is or isn't a big deal, which it isn't. One more good note from my security research friend here, Thomas. It's also worth noting that if you try to use middleware in the way that it normally works, which is adding a user object to the context, then it's not super likely this affects you, because skipping the middleware means routes won't have a user object in context. Very important point. The value of middleware as an auth check isn't that it's blocking you, it's that it's adding information to the request. So you could imagine how right here, I might add new data to the response before I do the rewrite or redirect in order to have more context on who you are. I use the cookie to check who you are, get your user info, and then add that as additional context on the request before it makes it to Next.js. As long as I'm checking the user object on the request somewhere, we're fine. The point being is that the only way this would affect you is if you don't do any additional auth checks or even checking the data that comes from your auth layer anywhere else in your app. It's also worth noting if you use pretty much any of the tools that I recommend, this won't be a problem for you either. Stuff like TRPC fully circumvents this by having its own layer that I showed a bit of before. Here, I'm checking the auth that is coming from, in this case, Clerk, that has been attached to the headers that exist in this request instance. And now I have this session data all over. So if I go down to my protected procedure code here, if I don't have a session user ID, I throw an error. That makes it effectively impossible for you to access sensitive data that's behind one of these procedures, because this code can only be hit if you have a valid session on the request. More from Zem here. This is what makes me a bit skeptical about it affecting NextAuth, which, if you're not familiar, NextAuth is an open source package that's iffy on how well maintained it is. It's hard to confirm, but it seems like you can't just drop the entire middleware and have it fail. My assumption there would be if you call any auth check or user check anywhere, that it will just 500 error because the data doesn't exist because you bypass the layer that adds that data. The harsh way of putting it is, if your app is able to be exploited by this, there's probably a lot of other ways to exploit your app. The only reasonable thing I could fathom that would allow for an app to be exploited by this would be an internal tool that has its own internal auth that is exposed to the internet publicly for some reason, where all signed-in users have full permission to everything, and you're using middleware because you're too lazy to implement any actual auth anywhere else. That's the only fathomable set of edge cases I can comprehend that results in this being an actual exploit, which is what leads us to the next unfortunate thing for Vercel. The 9.1 severity makes people's brains fall out. The severity that was marked for the CVE was very high, because in the cases where you are using this as your only layer for auth, it's very severe. The combination of high severity, CVE, the term middleware, and the term auth has resulted in our monkey brains creating a word cloud that makes this seem absolutely atrociously bad. And I understand why we would get there. If you're expecting middleware to mean a thing it doesn't because Next named it wrong, and you have had a bad experience deploying Next other places because it's not built to deploy serverless in places other than Vercel, and you see a 9.1 severity issue that affects auth and middleware, you're going to be outraged. And that makes all the sense in the world. What makes it much worse is that the majority of people talking about this incident don't even use Next. This was so frustrating to me. When I saw all the posts about this and the severity of it, every single one of them that got over 1,000 likes for the first 24 hours was somebody who doesn't actually use Next.js at all or understand it. There are people saying, wasn't Vercel late to the fix? Okay, here's the timeline. 227, the vulnerability report between the maintainers. It did specify an old version. Second follow-up 2 days later, saying that all versions were vulnerable, including latest stable releases. Initial response from the Vercel team saying that version 12 was no longer maintained. Another follow-up email the same day saying the team would take a look at the second email security template. 311, another email sent to find out whether or not the new information had been taken into account. Okay, so this doesn't clarify. These two are follow-ups that the researcher did. So it seems like this is another one of the misfortunate things. Original report was for a version of Next that is no longer maintained. And the disclosure updated that report instead of filing a new one. This is not an excuse. This is a bad misfortune of the nature of how these things are managed internally. By the time Vercel confirmed that they had this new information and was being taken into account, they had patched it within 24 hours. By the time Vercel actually knew and understood what this exploit was, it was patched insanely quickly. The problem, and this isn't a fault of the person who reported here, the discloser made a reasonable assumption that they could follow up the previous email, and whatever system they're using to triage all of this internally made it less clear that this was a big deal. Apparently, Vercel has their own proper timeline breaking down a lot of these things too. They got a disclosure that was initially for old versions. Additional email got sent in a new thread, which extended the affected scope. Multiple reports submitted, internal conversations, triaging was delayed. They started planning on the 5th, outlining plans to do an LTS policy, which would place Next 11 and 12 out of support. Security team raised the report to the Next team to begin researching impact and remediation options. The Next engineering team confirmed the vulnerability as valid. Since Next can be hosted in multiple ways, they had to confirm all the different ways. They found a validation method that handles almost all the cases, published the patch, published the CVE, made it public. The CVE did not state immediately whether Vercel applications were impacted. It was later updated. We quickly published a changelog on Vercel stating customers were protected. Changelog used the same template from our last resolution, which mentioned our firewall. This was another one of those owns, and I'll put that in the list. 7, Vercel disclosure had an ad for their firewall product. Another massive misfortune because they were rushing to get this out. When they did that, they used a template from previous issues that included an ad for the firewall, which made it look like an upsell, which is not fortunate. I did see a lot of people skeptical about why this wasn't published on their socials and all these other things. And I would like to remind them, the whole company was flying out at that moment. A lot of the people who would have done those things are people who are remote that have to fly. So it makes all the sense in the world that they were offline. I even talked to a few of them. They're like, holy shit, what happened when I was in the air? Here's their technical analysis. Pattern that some Next applications adopt is using middleware to optimistically verify a user's auth state by checking cookies. If an auth cookie is set, you can early redirect to the logged in application or block specific routes. We do not recommend middleware to be the sole method of protecting routes in your application. And if you read through the docs and see how they recommend doing auth, they are clear with that, even if the one page on middleware was unclear about that. And that page was horrible. They should not have discussed it in the way that they did. Big mistake on their part. But the docs themselves, as you go deeper, do clarify this. The reason that they even have this header, if you're curious, why would this exploit happen, is to prevent recursion. So if I have this internal API endpoint that gets the sensitive data, and I want to call that from in here, the call I make in here to get that data, const from API equals await, I could even do /API here. This shouldn't have to go through middleware again because it already did. And you can see how quickly we'd end up in recursive hell if all of these are calling middleware, getting redirected or rewritten to the wrong place. People have gotten some pretty scary Vercel builds because middleware failed and they got stuck in redirect loops, which is why they added the sub request functionality here in order to prevent middleware from being hit on these internal requests. It's very unfortunate you could hijack that externally by applying that header. But when you remember what the goal of middleware is, which is an optimistic layer to run between the user and the server, it makes sense. It's just a bad set of intentions for the product, name and marketing of the product, implementation of the product, workarounds around that implementation for edge cases within the product, communication of all of this, and the process to get these things reported and triaged. All of these little pieces collided in something that results in, to be frank, really bad optics. This sucks for Vercel. The ratio of affected users to brand hit that they're going to take here is absurd. But it's also somewhat deserved because a handful of these mistakes are entirely their fault, and they should have done more before. I have been yelling at Vercel for how badly this is named for a while. I've also been yelling at other companies for recommending middleware as an auth layer for even longer. I have been roasting Clerk for over 2 years about this. And the reason I've been roasting Clerk for so long is that most of our requests for support in the upload thing world were because their default middleware blocked upload thing. It also blocked webhooks. It also blocked Stripe. It also blocked pretty much anything you can do with TRPC by default because middleware's the wrong place to do auth blocking. If you want to prevent a user from accessing something, the thing itself should check. I haven't read this part yet, so I'm curious what Vercel's next steps are. The first big piece is they're doing a partner mailing list. They're opening up this list for companies that host Next so that they can disclose things privately first before they go public. They're also going to simplify how issues get reported. They've consolidated security at Vercel and responsible disclosure at Vercel so that they both use GitHub's private vulnerability reporting. This is a huge thing. My guess is that the email about this report went to security at Vercel when it should have went to the responsible disclosure email, because this one goes to the Vercel security team, which has nothing to do with the Next.js open source project team. They're also improving how the teams actually respond to disclosures and enhance their runbooks when Next.js vulnerabilities are disclosed. Long-term support, they now have an actual LTS policy, which I guess they didn't before, which is interesting. Deployment adapters, vulnerability relied on an internal header that was undocumented. That's, yeah. It's also worth noting that Cloudflare, in their attempts to fix this, broke a bunch of other things with middleware. So, yeah. And then we have the security assessment. We're further investigating if there are additional places to improve the security of middleware. All subsequent issues uncovered will follow the new CVE process. Good. Finally. I do want to showcase one rough thing, though. You might have noticed I put this layout here. Why? Why would I care about writing a layout here? The reason is some very unintuitive behavior that bit us originally when we put up upload thing at first. If I was to go back to our little diagram I drew earlier, we can think a little deeper about the hierarchy here. After middleware, we're actually going to the app, and that app has multiple layers. Let's ignore the unauth path for now. We'll just have the happy path. The user is trying to go to /admin, but we don't go straight to /admin. We go a few other places along the way. First, we have to go to the root/layout. The root layout is this file here that handles things like your fonts, your metadata, and it also generates the HTML in the body. This is the first thing that is hit when a request is made to your service after the middleware. So once the middleware is approved or rejected the request, added whatever it's going to it, the root layout gets hit. Then the child that gets mounted, the children here, are whatever the URL dictates based on the URL you have. So if you have multiple layouts throughout the URL, because every chunk of the URL can have its own layout, those layouts get hit, and then you get to page TSX. So the child of this body tag here is going to be admin layout, and then the child of this is going to be admin page. So we get the root layout, then we get admin layout, and then finally we get admin page. This is the layers a request goes through in order to properly get generated in Next. So you would think auth checks in these layers would protect you. If I had an auth check, if I just moved this out of admin page and instead put it in the layout here, this all seems fine and dandy, and it might even work. If I remove this cookie, yeah. Or is that because the middleware is doing it? That might be because the middleware is still doing its thing. Let's comment out the middleware. Cool, there we go. You can't see the URL because it's being covered by my face, but it did change. So I have this to /admin, and when I hit enter, it gets changed to /unauth, because that is happening in the layout here, because I have a redirect to /unauth if you hit that case. Why am I talking about all this? Well, it turns out if you can get through this layer in any way, you can access page data for anything. So if you're checking your auth in layout, the separation between these sections is great enough that you have a vulnerability there as well. So if instead of /admin, I'm going to a user profile, we'll say it's user 1, and then we go to user 1's page. If I can break through here via user 2, it is actually possible to get in a state where from the user 2 auth check you passed, you can hijack the user 1 page. So you can desync effectively the layout that you accessed and the page that gets rendered underneath it. Reproing this is nearly impossible. It requires some crazy network reverse engineering tools that I do not have. But somebody was able, right when we dropped upload thing, to add and remove files from my app through their dashboard by circumventing that layout. Genuinely terrifying. So this is something that no one talks about. I know that because when I ran into the problem, people thought I was insane. The official Vercel recommendation is to not auth check in layout, not do anything but rendering your layout in layout. But this is scary. This is very scary. So how are we supposed to do auth if we can't do it in middleware and layouts? Vercel has this awesome article that Sebastian wrote a while back. I did a whole video on it. This is where the taint gets introduced. If you're not familiar, watch the Theo React taint video. It's a classic. Their recommendation is that you pick between a couple different options. Your data should be accessed through one of these. HTTP APIs, like classic, you have an old service on Python or Go or something, and you're just using Next to hit those, even on server side. You have the data access layer, which is what's recommended for new projects. This is what we use for all of our stuff. If you're using tRPC as your layer for getting data, you're using a data access layer already. And then the component level data access. This is for prototyping and learning, in their words, like what I just did here, where I'm accessing data by just reading it from file system. That is component level data access. If you were calling SQL directly in line here, same deal. The data access layer is their recommended way to do things. And they even have the example, data/auth, where I have my getCurrentUser function that gets the auth cookie, decrypts and validates it, and then returns the user. Now I have my server-only file in data/user_DTO, can see username, viewer user, public info, return true. Can see phone number. Viewer is admin or team equals the viewer team. Get profile DTO. We grab the rows where it matches the slug. We get the current user. Return username, can see username. We show it. Phone number, can see phone number. Show it. The point here being any data that is accessed in your app needs to be broken out into an access layer of some form, both for the sake of maintainability and code review. If you don't do something like this, good luck. But also because it's the right way to do it safely. When you have one thing to check auth and all of the functionality that requires auth exists in the same folder and you can check each function to make sure it's checking, great. Or if you have an API system like tRPC, GraphQL, or an external service using something like Express, you're good. The important piece to understand here about Next is that, to go back to the article here, Next is not a complete framework. This is not a good framing of what Next is. When I hear a complete framework, and then you immediately follow that with middleware, the expectation is you're comparing this to something like Express or Next.js that has a real middleware concept, that has a real auth concept, that has a real context and all these pieces. Next.js, to its strengths and weaknesses, is a very primitive framework. It gives you the pieces to assemble. The same way that React doesn't really have a concept of global state and you have to add it yourself using the primitives, Next doesn't have a concept of global auth and you have to build it yourself using the primitives. That is why I love Next, but it's also why Next gets thrown into so much shit all the time, and it's why a lot of people do things so terribly with Next. It's the reason you can squeeze out unbelievable performance in it. It's the reason T3 chat is as good as it is, because I could turn off all the Next stuff I don't want and work around certain parts to add my own solutions. But it's also why there are some terrible performing Next apps, because if you're using those primitives wrong or you're making bad assumptions about them, it's very easy to build something slow. One of the most common performance issues I've seen in Next apps is using middleware for something really slow, like checking your database. If your database is slow to respond, adding a middleware just made your entire site significantly slower. Generally speaking, I try to not include middleware if I don't have to, and if I do, I make it as fast as possible, find cache layers to avoid it being hit, and then make sure I match out any static content so that it only gets hit during routing. Funny enough, Next is currently working on some new functionality that's in experimental for not implementing auth. Like, they're not giving you an auth check function, but they're giving you helper functions you can call when your auth checks fail. So if I have a verify session function from wherever I'm doing my auth check, and the role is not admin in this case, and we're on the admin page, I can call the forbidden function as a helper from Next to get you out of this path. But that is what Next's concept is. It's not how do you do auth, it's little primitives for how to get out of it. One more piece of note with these forbidden helpers is you cannot call them in layouts. You can only call them in server components, actions, and route handlers, which prevents them from being hit in the insecure case with the layout wrapper that I just showed. This is an awesome step in the right direction, but again, the direction is primitives. Next isn't a complete framework that provides these concepts in depth. Next is a primitive framework that adds these concepts as pieces you can assemble and build yourself. This only says root layout. Can you call that in other layouts, like nested ones? It just says root layout. I don't care enough to try it, but I might have been wrong with this not working in layout. And if I am, hey Vercel, hey Next team, I know you're watching this. These functions better not fucking work in layouts. Don't do this to me. You made this hard enough as is. My requests to Vercel. These are the things I think should happen to make my life easier so I don't have to deal with these things as much in the future. Request 1, obviously, jump on CVEs really hard and really, really early. Duh. Hopefully I don't have to clarify that. Point 2, please stop using names that don't mean what they usually do. The classic example I've been bitching about here forever is use client. I still think this is one of the biggest fumbles in modern software design. Not use client. Use client is fine. The problem is the mirror. Use server. If you understand what use client does, you almost certainly no longer understand what use server is for, because they have almost no overlap between the fact they're meant to be used together. There's a great Ryan Dahl quote from his talk, 10 Things I Regret About Node, where he effectively says, if you're thinking of an API design decision and your feeling is, oh, that's cute, I like it, scrap it. These cute decisions do nothing but cause you pain long term. And Next.js has made a handful of these that make me feel sick. I hate the way that these things get named sometimes, and it is very, very frustrating. Then again, I still defend names like Edge Runtime, because funny enough, that one actually was coined at Cloudflare, even though people at Cloudflare have shit on Vercel for using it. It's a whole thing. Names need to not be colliding with existing concepts in people's heads. If they have a concept of what middleware is, they're going to assume when Next adds middleware that it is the same thing they are used to. Even if the dictionary definition of middleware does meet the way Next uses it, it does not meet the expectations that users have with this word. We need to stop doing this. It does nothing but make our lives harder, both me as an educator and you as the provider. When these things are named poorly, everyone's job becomes more difficult, and we are just waiting for incidents like this. I firmly believe if middleware was named correctly, this would not have been an issue at all. If this was route redirect layer can be hijacked and skipped, no one would have talked about it. But that adds to point 3, which is audit your fucking bullet point lists. This is the 3rd or 4th time one of these bullet point lists in the docs has screwed us. I am so tired of this problem. The bullet point list shouldn't be every theoretical capability of the thing. It should be the golden intended use cases with very clear blinders showing where those limitations are. This happened in the past when server actions, which are very specifically for actions that cause changes, mutations, so to speak, destructive actions, a server action, the way it was implemented for the last 2 years, should not be used for fetching data. Because if you have 2 components that need data and they're both doing it through server actions, they are blocking sequentially. You can't do 2 server actions at the same time. It is a terrible API for fetching data. But they mentioned in one of these bullet point lists near the end, by the way, you can technically use this for data. No, you should not do it. The point of a summary list isn't to show all of the capabilities, it's to show the intended ones. And the screenshot I showed earlier that Aaron dropped is very damning. This page should not have existed in this state in the docs. Combine this with the fact that it's named wrong, and now there's a security incident. This is preventable. A thorough audit needs to be done of the Next docs as well as the rest of the Vercel docs to make sure every instance with a bullet point list does not include things that aren't the recommended path. This is really bad, and it needs to stop. And this one is small, but I think it's important. I don't know how much Vercel could even do here. We need to market Next better, not a competitor to Laravel. Next needs to be better understood as a set of primitives. People from the security world, for the most part, don't know anything about what Next is meant to be used for. They see Next as an alternative to other full-stack frameworks like Rails and Laravel. The thing that makes Next great is similar to the thing that made React great. When everyone else was providing these all-in-one solutions, React focused on giving you the primitives for good component architecture. When everyone else was focused on full-stack frameworks that support every single edge case and use case and package you can imagine, Next.js made it easier to have your backend and frontend interact. I don't know how we solve this problem. I'm doing my best on my end, but the idea of Next as a set of primitives that you assemble is really important. But part of that is make sure the primitives are named accordingly. I know this is what I said here, but I really want to emphasize this point. If people are mentally mapping Next to Laravel, then they're mapping the terms between the two as well. If middleware means one thing in Laravel and it means something else in Next, no one's going to get that. Since Next is so different, it should also use different terms. And I am so tired of dealing with this. And once again, I hope you guys understand, I have no financial obligation or tie to Vercel. I have more investment and financial tie to most of their competition than I do to them at this point. I have biases because I'm friends with people who work there and I'm using their product for stuff. But I hope the fact that I tore them to shreds here shows that I'm not just trying to protect them from something. They made a shitload of preventable mistakes here, and they need to fundamentally change the way they communicate about a handful of things in order to prevent this going forward. This almost feels like the inevitable conclusion to things I've been bitching about to them both publicly and privately for 4+ years now. They're not scared of inventing new names for rendering techniques. Why are we scared of inventing a new name for something that isn't middleware? And I knew this one was going to happen too. When everybody was complaining about middleware not running on Node, I knew this was a problem. I really hope the severity of this incident shows them that my bitching about the name problem isn't me just bitching because it's hard to teach people. It's me concerned about these misunderstandings and the ways that they cause problems. And all of that said, as I've diagrammed now multiple times and shown you the examples of, it is genuinely hard for me to fathom a production app that was genuinely insecure as a result of this vulnerability, which means that the CVE rank doesn't feel like a good fit, and the outrage everyone had online doesn't either. More apps were broken and made insecure through Cloudflare's attempt to patch this than were insecure because of it in the first place. And if anyone has an app that actually was made insecure as a result of this and they're down to share the source code with me, I'll give you a free audit. I'm genuinely curious because it is so hard for me to comprehend what an app vulnerable to this looks like. And my honest guess is that app is vulnerable to a lot of other sidechain attack style things as well. Because if I can get through your middleware at all, and that's the only place your auth checks are happening, there's a very good chance you're exposing that data incorrectly somewhere else. So to summarize, the Vercel has a lot of shit to fix in how they communicate stuff. I don't think anyone's actually affected, and I'm very curious if you are. And everyone who's been outraged publicly about this has outed themselves as someone who shouldn't be listened to in discussions about this, because most of them are clearly very biased and or unaware of what this actually was. I am amazed at how many people outed themselves as untrustworthy sources throughout this. It is quite frustrating, but it is what it is. Credit where it's due, a handful of people, when I reached out, recognized that their understanding was entirely wrong and took down their bad posts and updated them accordingly. But for every one person who did, 5 didn't. And I have seen so many viral posts that fundamentally don't understand what happened here. Once again, huge thanks to everybody who stopped by to help out throughout this. Appreciate each and every one of you guys. I've been talking to everybody from security researchers to the Vercel Next team to actual people deploying these things in the public. Yeah. Oh, and great. The Forbidden helper is available in layouts. Vercel. And one last piece. If you want to better understand how to do auth right, I have 2 videos. This one's much more recent, where I go through all the different auth providers that exist and the differences between them and how to set them up properly. Good thing to watch if you want to better understand how to authenticate your apps safely. I think that's all I have on this one. Keep your apps safe. Until next time, peace, nerds.